Thank you everybody for coming. So today I'm going to talk about some of the consulting work that we did recently. So I'm Patrick. Kyle Payton is currently based in Australia, although he's an American, and he's a future grad student. And so this is some of the work that we did in Australia for the 2013 election, which just happened in September. So what am I going to do today, right? So I'm going to present some results from a field experiment on voter persuasion in Australia, right? So voter persuasion is sort of a unique sort of effect, and it's different from what I'm going to call turnout effects, right? So I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but I think our sort of experiment gives us some leverage in isolating the persuasion effect from the turnout effect. So we conducted this experiment under great uncertainty, and eventually it actually failed partly. And so I'm going to show how our design sort of tries to recover results that are feasible despite the uncertainty and the brokenness. And then we're going to implement some statistical methods to account for missing data and treatment non-compliance, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that is. And our main result is that we find a 10 percentage point effect of what we call direct phone calls on vote choice, conditional on actually delivering the message. What this means is if we call you and you actually let us talk to you, we found a 10 percentage point effect on your vote choice. So I want to start by talking a little bit about sort of the existing literature and the existing experiments. So I'm sure most of you have heard this explosion of sort of data analytics for election that actually goes way back, but has recently gotten a lot of attention. There was a piece on the monkey cage recently all about this. And so most of this stuff is based in the US. I would say 99% of it is based in the US because that's where it's been developed in the most. So here what we have is, I believe we have the first documented field experiment really that we know of. And if you know of others, please tell me. In a compulsory voting electorate. Okay, and what does it mean by compulsory voting electorate? It means basically everybody has to vote, right? So this is clearly different from the US where you can decide whether you want to come vote or not. So most of the literature is usually on the get out the vote GOTV experiments. So what does this mean? It means that most of the experiments we do is sort of trying to get you to go to your polling place and vote, mostly regardless of how you're going to vote, although parties do care about how you're going to vote. But most of the experiments are on sort of just getting you to turn out. And this is really nice because voter turnout data is publicly available. So I can just go to your sort of local electoral commission, and I can just find out whether or not you actually came out to vote. There's a much smaller literature on persuasion, right? So persuasion basically means, can I change your mind on who you're going to vote for? And the limitations are obvious, right? So the outcome is really difficult to measure. We have secret ballots. I can never really for sure tell you, know how you actually voted. Almost all of it relies on post-election surveys. So basically we go back and we ask you, how did you vote in the most recent election, right? And as you can imagine, there's high degree of non-response. A lot of people don't like to tell you how they voted. And questionable accuracy, right? So even if I do tell you, do you really believe me, right? And so in the US, it's really difficult to sort of disentangle the turnout effect from the persuasion effect. If I do an experiment on you and sort of I see an effect, was it just because I got you to turn out, or was it because I actually changed your mind? Right? So to think about this a little bit further, I want to disentangle what I call the persuasion effect, right? So just some basic notation. Y is our binary vote choice or intention. So you can think about this as you vote Democrat or Republican, right? And I'm gonna, for now, let's pretend that your vote choice and your vote intention are the same. So you're gonna vote if your intention is to vote Democrat, and then when you actually come out to vote, you're actually going to vote your vote intention. That's all I mean. Let's let T be your binary turnout status, so whether or not you actually turned out to vote. And W is our binary treatment status. So we can think of a treatment as like a campaign worker coming to your door, or the campaign sending you a piece of mail, right? And so let's think about this in the US for right now. Right, so what do I mean by the turnout effect, or sort of the treatment effect on turnout, right? So in just sort of potential outcome notation, mathematically, it's just the average effect of T1 minus T0. So it's whether your turnout status when you got the treatment minus your turnout status when you got your control. So that's sort of the effect of how effective was our treatment in getting you to turn out. And here, now what I'm going to talk about as the persuasion effect. And so this, I'm going to define this notationally, and you can feel free to disagree with me, and I would love to hear what you think about this. But it's sort of, right now what I'm going to define it as is y1 minus y0. So how you vote given treatment minus how you voted given control, given that your T1 and your T0 is equal to 1. So if you're going to be a voter anyway, what is the effect of the treatment on how you voted, right? So let's think about this, right? So let's think about this right side right here, right now, right? So basically, let's consider 3 possibilities, right? So first possibility is you're going to vote anyway. The second possibility is T1 equals 1 and T0 equals 0. So that means that my treatment had an effect on your voting. It sort of if you got the treatment, you came out to vote. And if you didn't, you didn't come out to vote. So that's the turnout effect. And the third possibility is T1 and T0 are both 0. So you weren't going to vote no matter what I did to you. Right? And so here I'm saying that the persuasion effect is conditional on you being voted, you voting, right? So if you're a campaign, right? So do I care if you're not going to vote anyway, and then I kind of change your mind on who you wanted to vote for? Does it really matter? Like, do campaigns really care about your vote choice when you're not going to vote anyway? Right? So my argument is no, and my argument is that's not really what people mean by the persuasion effect. And if we consider T1 to be 1 and T0 to be 0, so if there is an effect on your turnout, and we looked at your difference in vote choice, well, is it sort of like, what was the effect, right? What is the effect sort of, did I turn out were you a Democratic voter anyway, and I just turned you out? Or were you actually a Republican voter, and not only did I turn you out, but I changed your mind on who you would vote for, right? So there's like 2 effects there that sort of get mixed up. And so I'm going to define right now very cleanly as just the persuasion effect is amongst voters changing your vote choice, right? Dustin. Yeah.
Could be slightly more complicated in the sense that if you got the treatment and you persuaded someone to adopt an alternative position in their head, but because of that, they're like very queasy about that alternative position, and then they don't turn out. Right?
I see.
Say I convinced you to be a Republican,
Mm-hmm.
and you're like, oh man, I feel really unsure about that. Now I'm not going to go out to turn out to vote.
I see. I think that's really interesting. I haven't thought about that as a possibility, but I think that is one possibility that I think we'll consider in the future. For now, I'm just going to simplify it for now. And so my point here is just that the ability to choose both to turn out and who you vote for makes estimating the persuasion effect a little bit difficult. Right? So what do typical experiments on voter persuasion in the US do, right? So one way is, we're just going to look at people who voted, right? So if you didn't vote, we're just not going to look at you. The other way is we're going to look at vote intention. So we're just going to ask you, who did you want to vote for, right? regardless of whether you actually voted or not. And the third is let's recode Y in some way to include both turnout and your vote choice. Right? So let's think about each one of these. So these are actually the three ways in which the current literature sort of gets around this turnout effect, although not explicitly, right? They don't actually talk very much about this. And my point here is that they should talk a little bit more about this. And so, yeah.
Question on the theory side, in the US case, we go back one. Actually, it's something entitled it. So, what types of people are we talking about here? Sort of theoretically, it's people who are committed to vote, and they're going to vote no matter what, in some sense, but have not committed to a particular party. I see how that makes sense in like the compulsory voting situation where everyone has to go to the polls, and there's some extra effect. But just theoretically, what types of people does this correspond to in the United States?
I mean, it could just be like sort of people who really believe in their civic duty to vote, right? And so, but they're still undecided about, or they're persuadable in a sense, right? Like I'm leaning Democrat, but if your treatment is particularly good, I might turn Republican. Like it.
Yeah, I mean, do you think these good citizen types, really exist? I mean, so basically, I think the reason that turnout in Australia is so high relative to other places is precisely because they don't exist. You see what I mean, right? So Australian turnout, 90-100%. It's precise, and the reason it's so high is precisely because we don't have these good citizen types in reality. You have to force people to go to the polls. Maybe they do exist. I don't know. I don't know what the proportion of the electorate which has that characteristic is.
Right. I mean, I don't know either. I think that's an empirical question.
The Fowler's argument here, which might not be stomachable, is that this is sort of a personality type. It's a habitual thing. I don't know if they estimate the sort of percentages, which is what you want, but it's quite stable.
This genetic business. Yeah. Okay.
I mean,
As I said, you might be like that. It is printed in our legal journals.
Well,
genetics. The long literature on habitual voting.
switchers. Okay, all right.
I mean,
on the flip side, though, you see that it's strong Democrats and strong Republicans tend to be the most likely people to participate. So, and those are going to be the least persuasive.
that's definitely true, right? So it could be that the persuasion effect for these people, like the persuasion effect could be 0, precisely because I'm only limiting it to strong partisans either way. But I do think there is a core. There are people who are are civic-minded duty to vote and are persuadable. And I think that's what people are trying to measure, right? Is sort of what is that effect? Like how effective can we be on those people, right? And so I think that could be part of it. So if we only look at those people who actually voted, right? So let's imagine our data set, and we're going to throw out people who didn't vote and only keep people who did vote. And let's look at sort of the difference in Y for people who got the treatment versus didn't get the treatment. So it's just really basically your difference in Y conditional on your T actually being equal to 1. So this is only equal to the persuasion effect that I described if T1 equals T0, right? Just mathematically speaking. So basically what this means is that if you only look at those people who actually voted, you make an assumption that your treatment has no effect on turnout, right? That if I give you a phone call, that if I want the persuasion effect of that phone call, we have to assume that there was no sort of turnout effect, okay? And so this is what studies that do this and try to look at the persuasion effect. This is an implicit assumption they're making, right? And so a second option is let's only look at vote intention, right? So I'm going to throw away all my turnout data. I'm going to ask you, who did you quote unquote support, or who did you want to vote for? So basically, I'm not conditioning on turnout. I'm just looking at your difference in means across treatment and control. So it's only equal to the persuasion effect if your turnout status is independent of your vote choice. These periods here are weird typos. But so to see this, right? So this is my turnout effect here, right? And this This on the right-hand side is a decomposition of E of y0 minus y1. Right, so in order for this to equal that, this equation must be true. Right? And so what does this equation mean, right? So it has three parts, right? It's the effect of my treatment on persuasion for always voters, right here. This is the effect of treatment on your outcome for sort of what I call turnoutable voters, right? So people who would turn out if you treat them but not otherwise. And the effect for never voters, right? And then you weight them by the probability in the sample. And so there are a couple ways this can be true, right? So if none of these two people ever exist, so if everybody votes, then of course this would be true. If the effects are all the same, so if your persuasion effect is always the same regardless of what your turnout status or your sort of turnout ability is, then these two would always be equal. So generally speaking, I think the heuristic is your turnout behavior does not affect your vote outcome, is really when this would be true. Right, and so let's think about this, right? So, sorry, I don't mean turnout behavior does not affect, I mean it's just independent. So how would it not be independent, right? So if if I only turn out if I feel strongly about a candidate or something like that, then this would be violated, right? So if we only look at vote intentions, which a lot of studies do, this is the assumption we're making. There's a third way that people might do this. So we're just going to recode y, right? So instead of y being 1 if you vote Democrat and 0 if you vote Republican, let's go 1 if you don't go Democrat, 0 if you don't turn out, and -1 if you vote Republican. So let's code non-voters as a midpoint. Let's code non-voters as a separate category of y. It's just Republican voters, Democratic voters, and non-voters, right? So I haven't thought enough about this, and I need to think more about this. But there's got to be a bias here somewhere, right? It's an unknown direction bias because basically if you look at your outcomes, you're not taking into account type there, right? So unless you make some very strong assumption, there's going to be bias. I think it depends on how your treatment affects turnout. If anybody has sort of any brilliant insight or literature on this, I think this is sort of the next step that I'm going to try to think about.
Do you think you could probably write the DAG?
Sorry.
Do you think this works? Do you think you could write a DAG for how this works?
Probably, but I would imagine there are arrows going all over the place, right? Like, I mean, turnout affects voting, and voting affects turnout, and your treatment affects both. I mean, I could think about it, writing a DAG.
But I'm worried that by conditioning turnout, we're conditioning on a post-treatment variable.
We are conditioning on a post-treatment variable, but I'm arguing that that is what the persuasion effect is. Like, you need a condition on that. In some ways, it's kind of like a mediating effect, in a sense that.
So that creates identification and estimation issues. Yes, that might be the thing you're interested in.
Yeah, I think there are huge identification issues here, and I think what I'm going to present tries to get around this. I'm just trying to bring up the issue that there are identification issues with current studies on persuasion.
Isn't sort of if T and Y are both outcomes, and non-voters is a separate category of Y, so do it. And then if you drop the last category of the non-voters, as people often do, then you're making sort of independence of a relevant alternative assumption. So maybe you can use some of the literature to figure out exactly what the bias is.
I think that's a good idea. Thanks. Okay. So here's the point that's related to what we did, right? So in compulsory voting electorates, if you take the difference in means of the outcomes, it's approximately equal to the persuasion effect that I defined, precisely because everybody is in this almost everybody is in this category. Right? So almost everybody votes. And we know this because turnout in the 2013 federal election was 93%, and that's actually low for Australia. It's usually around 95%. Right? So I would argue it's approximately equal, not exactly, but we're getting there. And so I think this, the fact that we can do this in Australia gives us sort of an identification, sort of a way to identify this persuasion effect. Here.
Can you talk briefly about the people who don't vote, and like, do we know anything about them, and do we know like what's the consequence of not voting in Australia?
Yeah, so we don't know a lot about them, but we do know the consequence. You have to pay $20, basically. So it seems trivial, right? But if we think about sort of all our literature on sort of why do people turn out, right? It's like the cost of turning out versus the benefit of voting. Well, the cost is $20. I guess I mean, that's not a huge cost, but again, turning out to vote is also not a huge, like driving to your polling place, is it worth $20? Like, I mean, you can calculate the gas and the time and whatnot, but $20 is enough to get most people to vote. And even more than that, I think it creates a culture of voting, right? So if 93% of the people vote, in addition to the fine, just the culture, like it changes over time. And this has been going on since at least the 1800s. So most people do vote. And I think in Australia, it's turnout is not an issue, right? Like, who are the 7% who didn't vote? I mean, I don't really know, but I can imagine they're probably outliers of the population in some way. So yeah, Kiara.
But it's actually a percentage that you follow blank. 7%, like not very official.
Yeah, so there are some do leave them blank. There are other things called invalid votes. Invalid voting in Australia for 2013 was 5%. So it's relatively low. I mean, even if you count that, it's about 90% turnout. So it's still a sizable, a huge proportion. So what is Australia? Australia is generally a two-party system, right? So you have the Labour Party on the left. You have what's called the coalition, which is a coalition of two parties, generally two large parties, the Liberal and the National Party on the right. And you have a few sort of smaller parties scattered around. One of them is the Greens, but they're generally smaller. You vote for Parliament, so you vote for the House and the Senate. Really, the House is what matters, because the House determines who the Prime Minister is, right? There are 150 electorates, so 150 members of the House, one from each electorate. I'm going to use the word electorate here just to mean like districts. So they call it electorate, but it's just district. So the Labour Party was in power following 2007. They won in a landslide, and Kevin Rudd became their prime minister. And then in 2010, they also won, but barely. They actually had a minority government. They were 4 seats away from a majority. And so they were still in power under Julia Gillard. There were internal struggles within the ALP. It led to Kevin Rudd becoming prime minister again in June. So Kevin Rudd took over from Julia Gillard, who was under a lot of, she was very unpopular by the end. Once Kevin Rudd took over, he called an election for September 7, 2013. Basically, Australia has to have an election, I think, every 5 years. And so there was debate about, should we call it now? Because we just changed prime ministers and we want to capture that peak of his popularity. Should we wait until later and hope that the Labour Party gets more popular? So he called it for September 7th, which was relatively soon. And the ALP was widely expected to lose this. Right? The polls were not good. And they did, in fact, lose it by a landslide. So this is where we jump in, right? So we worked with the Australia Council of Trade Unions, the ACTU. It's the largest body representing workers in Australia. So it's basically the Australian version of the AFL-CIO. It consists of 46 affiliated unions, which is basically every major union in the country. The Australian Bureau of Statistics estimates about 1.8 million union members in Australia. I don't know how many are actually covered by the ACTU. I'm not sure they know either, but they're trying to sort of they're actually working to build a database on this. The ACTU is not explicitly partisan, but it is concerned about workers' rights, as all unions are. And they were very concerned about a potential coalition government. So what they decided to do in the run-up to the 2013 election, so the election was in September, and beginning January, they tried to implement this, this campaign, which is the largest voter persuasion campaign in the history of the union movement. And the campaign had a lot of facets. But the main goal was to try to minimize coalition votes. But they also did a lot of things, right? They tried to build a database of all union members that they represented. They tried to sort of upgrade their digital technology to be more sort of in tune with modern trends. And one aspect of the campaign was a field experiment to test the effectiveness of campaign techniques on voter persuasion. And by techniques here, we mean just phone calls and different types of mail. Right? And so the campaign was in 3 stages. So one, they established an initial phone survey, right? So they called 190,000 union members from 22 unions in 150 electorates. So what's important about this is that they launched this campaign, but not all unions within the ACTU chose to participate. Some actually probably leaned towards voting coalition. And so there was a lot of politics involved in actually getting people to participate and hand over their information. And so in the first stage, we got 22 unions to do it. So we called 190,000 people. And then in August, so about less than a month before the election, we did a randomized experiment. And right after the election, for about a month, we called them afterwards to do a post-election survey to ask them who they voted for. And as you can see here, the numbers get smaller, smaller, and smaller. Right? So one is that unions can also drop out after each stage. Right? So 22 initially were involved, and then only 11 decided to participate in the persuasion, the experiment. And then only 8 allowed us to call them afterward. Right? So the sample is not a random sample, it's a convenience sample. And so how do we pick the sample, right? So we started with 190,000 non-random union members that we called first, right? And so the thing is, when we were calling them, like the lists were coming in, so unions were opting in as we were calling. So there was really no way we can do a random sample. And then after we called them, the ACTU identified 32 electorates, which they thought were marginal, that could flip. And they identified these 32, and they said, do the experiment on this 32. And so there are approximately 50,000 members in the 32 electorates who were not identified as partisan in the initial phone survey. So what we wanted was, they didn't want to experiment on people who they knew were already partisan, that would vote one way or the other. So we would only call people who said they were undecided about who they wanted to vote for, or people that we didn't actually call.
Patrick, sorry, can I ask you a question about this nature of undecided? So this is not first past the post system, so people are doing alternative vote or FTV, they're listing numbers alongside the candidates and parties.
Yes.
So what does that mean to be undecided? What does it mean to persuade somebody?
Right. So we're going to abstract away from that. Basically, what undecided means is we asked you before the election, what party do you plan on supporting, right? During the 2013 election, and I think implicitly they're supposed to think, who am I going to put first in my ballot, right? And I think that's what we were trying to get at. There are issues of, well, if I like 2 parties equally, like what is that all about? We're just going to abstract away from that a little bit. And we'll get to the post-election survey, but it's the same idea. And then we did a follow-up survey on 8,000 members, right? So we because of sort of time and money issues, right? So we only had enough resources to call around 8,000 union members out of our initial 50,000. So what we did was we decided to call everybody who was identified as undecided before. So we wanted to make sure we got those people. And that's about sort of 6,000. And then we just added 2,000 more. But we'll eventually drop those anyways. Okay. So we eventually drop all but those who were initially identified as undecided. So we have a final sample of around 5,700 union members. Initially in our phone survey that was identified as undecided. They're from 8 unions and 31 electorates. There was one electorate which only had 3 people, so we decided to drop that. So this is really just a convenience sample. And you can think about what you want about that. I mean, it's not a random sample of the Australian population. It's pretty sort of, the 8 unions they're not all from like one occupation or one sector. They're pretty diverse. But the inference we are making is on the sample only. Okay. And so what do we want? What was our intended treatments, right? So we worked with the ACTU on this. We asked them what kinds of treatments do you want to test? So they said, oh, well, we have this what we call direct contact package, which is just we're going to call you and we're going to send somebody to knock on your door. And we're going to try to, and we have scripts for both to try to convince you to not vote conservative. We also want to test, well, what about just the call instead of the call and the home visit? So this is just a subset of the first one. We also have postcards, right? We're going to send a series of 3 colorful postcards that you get in the mail all the time telling you not to vote for the Conservative Party. We're going to also add a robocall to that. Okay, so the robocall is a message from the ACTU president with the same sort of message. We're going to have what we call formal mail. So instead of sending you 3 postcards, we're going to send you a signed letter from the ACTU, personally addressed with your name on it, asking you not to vote for the coalition. And then we have a control group where we didn't contact you at all. The messages were all very similar. They had basically the same telling you not to vote conservative and pointing out sort of salient campaign issues. Okay, so here's an example of one glossy mail postcard. Right, so this election we could lose our penalty rates, overtime, and protection. Here's the back of that one. Right, so something that you would get in the mail and throw away probably. Here's your formal mail, right? So very specifically addressed and signed by the president of the ACTU.
So it doesn't look like either, at least the first one I did this one, but it doesn't look like it actually says anything about any party.
Right.
So we're assuming that they're picking up this message. Like the people are smart enough to know that whenever you do workers' rights, that means anti.
Yes. So this one actually you have to make an assumption about that. This one actually does talk about Liberal leader Tony Abbott. So there might be a little bit of an issue here about like this one's more specific and the other one is not. That's definitely true. I think. And by the way, like we're probably gonna have a chance to do something like this again. So if you have suggestions on ways to improve this, I would love to hear them. And that is one of the issues that we would address, is to make this a little bit.
So I assume that the bold statement is a reference to the electoral system, right? So you literally put him last in your preferences.
Which bold statement?
So
oh, this one.
Bold is one I'm curious. If Mr. I want to put your
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Literally.
Yeah. So this is supposed to say put them at the bottom of your list. Well.
Yeah, I don't know. It's complicated for you guys to work out. Did you vote for him? Actually, you did. If he's on your ballot sheet, you did vote for him. You just voted for him in 10th place.
Right. So we never actually vote. We never actually said who you vote. I'm not. We'll get to the post-election survey, but I don't think we say who you voted for.
So if you, how does this work in Australia? Like if there's 10 parties, do you have to rank order all 10 of them, or
it's optional? It's optional whether you want to rank or whether you want to just put one.
So you can only put 1 or 10. You can't like list. Okay, I'd be okay with 1, 2, 3, and then the other 7.
I believe you can. I don't quote me on that.
So that's kind of interesting then that it says to put him last because it's almost suggesting put him on your like. So that there's. I don't know how.
You have to either put 1 or rank everybody. If you only rank something, then you
I see. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, that's great. Thank you. So, yeah. So, I mean, we definitely abstract all of it, right? So put him last. Like, did that subconsciously send a message to like put him on your ballot when they wouldn't have? I don't know, but we're gonna abstract away from that. So how do we do the randomization, right? So randomization, it had to take into account volunteers, right? So we had to do phone calls and home visits. And we couldn't reach as many people as we wanted because the number of volunteers for each electorate differed, and they only wanted people from your electorate to knock on your door, right? So they only wanted people from Cambridge to knock on Cambridge people. They didn't want anybody from Somerville knocking on a Cambridge person, right? So initially we said we were told that there were 16 electorates that had door knocking volunteers. And so what we did, we divided the 32 electorates in half of roughly equal size. And we separated them into two groups, 16 of them with door-knocking volunteers and 16 of them without. And so group A is the one with door-knocking volunteers. So we had 3 treatments, direct contact, glossy mail, and control. Group B did not have door-knocking volunteers. They only had phone call volunteers. Phone calls are a lot easier to do because you just sit in a room and do it. And so we had these 4 treatments. So we put the robocall treatments in here, right? So we were running into numbers issues, right? Like there's so many treatments. Can we sort of, how do we divide this? So we just did it this way. And so here's our design, right? So we start off with an experimental population around 50,000. We divide it in half. And the first one, what we did was in group A, we block an electorate. So we only, for each electorate, we assign a certain number to direct contact, a certain number to glossy mail, and a certain number to control. And the number of direct contact is much larger here. Why is that? So we had what we were told were a certain number of volunteers for door knocking in each electorate. And so we just made, and remember, this is the first time they have ever done anything like this. So they were supposed to do it over 2 weekends, and we had no idea how many people they can actually reach. So we just said 30 houses is per volunteer over 2 weekends. We're just going to say that's your number. That was definitely an overestimate, and we did that on purpose because we were concerned if we gave them too few to knock on, they might decide to knock on somebody else in their spare time or whatnot, and we didn't want contamination of that. And so we just said 30, an overestimate. But here are 30 houses that each volunteer should knock on. So, and then we capped this number at half of each electorate. So 30 per volunteer unless you go over half of the electorate size, and then we capped it there. In group B, we did the same thing. We block an electorate. We had 6,000 phone calls, and so these groups were relatively equal in size. And basically, we capped the phone calls to 1,000 per electorate. So we didn't think they could make over 1,000 calls. And we didn't actually know how many volunteers they had in these electorates. So it was just wild guessing, pretty much. And so we have all these people, and then we chose 8,000 of them for the post-election survey. And remember, we included everybody who was initially undecided, and then we dropped the other 2,300-ish that we never contacted in the first place. So that's our final sample. Implementation failures. So how did this fail? So the door knocking campaign pretty much didn't happen, right? So it didn't reach anywhere near the scale we thought. So they were supposed to door knock on like 10,000 of them. We don't know how many they actually did because, like this. Remember, this is the first time they did it. A campaign like this involves a lot of people, a lot of coordination, and it just didn't happen. I would guess they probably door knocked about 10% of what they were actually supposed to do. And the data collection was even worse. So they had data protocol, but they relied on sort of each electorate having their campaign field manager entering the data, and just things went wrong, right? So, and slightly less concerning was that not all people assigned to a phone call got called. And this was because they just didn't have enough people to do it, right? And so the one thing to notice is that when we told them who to call or door knock, we told them to start at the top with people who were identified as undecideds, right? So that helps a little bit because sort of the first people they should have reached were the undecided voters who we were targeting, right? And so what ended up happening are actual treatments. So this was, remember group A was direct contact, right? We just dropped the home visit and it became just the phone call. So now these two treatments are identical. The people that we know were door knocked, we dropped them. Okay, we didn't want any contamination there. And so here's what happened, right? So of the people, so this was what we had designed, and here's what we actually achieved. So the mail and control people were successful. These people were not. We were missing 4,000 of them. And here's group B. Again, we're missing 4,000 of them. Yes. So we'll talk about that, but it's just people who are assigned for a phone call. So these numbers are people who were actually given a call, whether or not they actually were home or whatnot. That's a different issue that we'll get to. Right? This number is a lot smaller than that number because they had more volunteers in these electorates, so they did those first. So here's our final sample. As you can see, in the top, it's pretty evenly spread out across the treatments. Here in the bottom, they didn't call as many people. Like they called much fewer people than the mail and the control because of volunteer issues. Right? So what's our outcome? Okay, so what is our outcome of interest? So back to Arthur's questions, we actually did ask which party did you vote for. I think you'll have to make the leap, and I don't think it's an unreasonable leap to say which party did you vote for means if you put 1, that's your party, and if you put 10, it's probably, so you're only allowed to give one answer to this. So it's probably the top one that you put if you had ranked 10 parties, for example. I mean, there might be issues with that. We might want to reword the question in the future, but I think that's the assumption you have to make. So our observed is 1 if you vote for the coalition, 0 if you voted for another party, and if you refuse to divulge your vote, or if we didn't reach you in your post-election survey, it's missing. 2,000 out of 5,700 people chose to reveal their votes. So that's just a little between a third and a half. Right? So that's a low response rate. And that's pretty typical of all these post-election surveys. We collected some covariates. Right? So from your union list, we had what electorate you're in, what union you're in, your gender, although that's 15% missing. Unions just don't have great records. And so what we did was we imputed this with honorific titles. So we had your title. If you're Mr. or Mrs., we imputed it with that. For the ones that didn't have titles, we had your first names. And your first name was completely, we had all your first names. And we matched that to the US Social Security Administration database. And we just took the sort of whichever, if you're a unisex name, we took whichever had more of it. I think this is pretty accurate. It's may not be 100%, but I think it's pretty accurate.
Couldn't you use the Australian essay?
Australian essay, they didn't have a database that we could find publicly. Age is actually 70% missing, so not a whole lot of unions collect age, and so we'll do something about that. And then we have a couple covariates from the post-election survey, like who did you support in the previous election? Were you contacted by the Labour Party? Were you contacted by the coalition in some way? We'll use some of this. We won't use it a whole lot because it's only observed for the 2,000 people who actually completed the post-election survey. Age range, right? So instead of your actual age, we have like 18 to 25 or whatnot. So what is our quantity of interest? So we're interested, one, in the ITT effects. So the effect of the phone call or mail campaign on voting, right? So if you were assigned a treatment, we want to know the effect of that. It's the intention to treat effect. We don't know if you actually received your treatment, right? So there's an idea of treatment noncompliance here, right? So if you were assigned a phone call, but we have the wrong phone number for you, then you didn't receive the treatment. We're going to lump that into non-compliance. You didn't answer the phone. We called you, and you didn't answer your phone. We called you, you answered your phone, but you said, I'm not interested in talking to you. So these are all related to the phone call treatment, and we'll say that all of these are you didn't comply with the treatment. For mail, right? So we sent you the mail, but it didn't reach your address, or you got it, but you didn't read it and you just threw it away. So that's non-compliance there, but we don't actually observe that, right? So we also estimate a complier average causal effect, which is but this is only for the phone call treatment, because we only observe compliance information for the phone call treatment. And so who are the compliers here? Are those who would answer the phone and listen to what you have to say if hypothetically you were assigned a phone call. And if you weren't assigned a phone call, then there's no defiers here. So you wouldn't receive the message from the phone call. Right? Okay, so we have clearly we have challenges here. There's a lot of missingness in our age covariate. There's treatment noncompliance, and there's high missingness in our outcome variable. So we're going to adapt the principal stratification approach to broken experiments. Don Rubin has a few papers on this. This one is the one that most people cite. It's Barnard et al. Right? It's on school choice and vouchers. Horiuchi and Kosuke Imai have another paper on this with a survey experiment in Japan. So this principal stratification approach, essentially what it does is it imputes missing data and our latent compliance status. Okay. So I'm going to describe the model, and very quickly, right? So Y is our vote outcome. Z here is our 5-category treatment assignment vector. So you're only assigned one of the 5 treatments. I can break this down into 4 binary treatments. So each of these is 1 if you received a phone call, for example, and 0 otherwise. So the otherwise can be you received another treatment or you were in control. So these are just, this is just derived from that. X is our covariates. D is a binary treatment indicator for whether or not you received the phone call treatment. So very importantly, D only applies to the phone call treatment. C is your latent compliance status. And R is a binary indicator for whether or not your outcome is observed. So R equals 1 if you gave us your vote. R equals 0 if you did not give us your vote. So we have to make some assumptions for this model. One is randomization of treatment and SUDVA. Those are your typical assumptions. So the important one here, what are we making about outcome missingness? What are we assuming about the way your outcome is missing? The first assumption we'll make is MCAR, missing completely at random. So, and we're going to also assume you have no treatment non-compliance first. So what MCAR means is that basically whether or not you gave us your vote was completely random, like you just basically flipped a coin, and it depends on nothing. That's the first assumption we'll make, and we'll have a model for that. The second, so these are we make 3 separate assumptions, and we do different things with each of them. The second is missing at random. So conditional on your covariates, so your missingness pattern does not depend on your actual value of Y, conditional on your covariates. So basically what this tells us is that we're assuming that your covariates tell us like how you're missing this pattern. If some union members from specific unions are more prone to not telling you their vote or whatnot, then that's that's the assumption that we're going to make. Right? So our covariates inform our missingness pattern. The last one is what's called latent ignorability, which is not only do your covariates inform your missingness pattern, but your compliance status also informs your missingness pattern. So we might imagine that people who don't answer their phone when they're getting treated are also less likely to either answer the phone in the post-election survey or actually tell you their vote, right? So these are people who, they just don't want to be bothered ever, And if you do bother them, they don't want to tell you anything, right? So if we knew your compliance status, that gives us more information about your likelihood of giving us your vote. So we're going to make each one of these assumptions, and so our estimates are true, are correct if these assumptions hold. Right? We're going to make some assumptions about your treatment noncompliance. These are very typical, one-sided noncompliance, so no always takers. So if you're not assigned a phone call treatment, you don't get a phone call treatment. No defiers. So if you were assigned phone call, you don't take the phone call, but if you weren't assigned phone call, then you do take the phone call. We're going to assume that never happens. That's a reasonable assumption. Compound exclusion. So this is a version of the exclusion restriction. Basically, what this says is that your treatment does not affect your vote outcome or your missingness pattern, conditional on your compliance status. Right? So if you're a non-complier, so if you never answer your phone, then the phone call treatment status does not affect your vote outcome or your missingness pattern. So how can this be violated? Right? So one way is if we call you and you pick up and you don't want to talk to us, and then that angers you so much that the next time we call you after the election, you're even less likely to give us your vote. So that would be one way in which this assumption is violated. We're going to assume this is true. Okay, and then we ran 4 separate models, right? So the first thing is we took the sample difference in means. So we take people who gave us our votes, and we're just going to take the difference in means of the outcomes. And so this assumes that your outcome missingness was completely at random and no treatment noncompliance. We're going to do this with regression. So we're going to adjust with regression using covariates from the union lists and the post-election survey. So again, this is only complete cases. And so the same assumption is made. We have an imputation model where we make the assumption about missing at random and still no treatment compliance. And we have this last model, which I'm going to show, is Bayesian imputation with principal stratification. So we're going to assume that latent ignorability assumption, that your covariates and your compliance status informs your missingness. And we're going to assume that you had treatment noncompliance. So here's the model, right? So what are we going to do? First, we're going to model your baseline compliance status. So without only knowing your covariates, what's your compliance? What's the probability of you being a complier? It's a probit model based on your covariates. Then we're going to model your age covariate because we need to impute your age. Age is 70% missing, and we think that age is an important covariate here. So we're going to assume that your age is drawn from a normal distribution, conditional on both how you voted, your compliance status, your other covariates, and your other covariates. It's truncated. Basically, age doesn't go on forever. We limited it to 18 to 83. And we also had information from your post-election survey about your age range. So if you gave us your age range, we further truncated that. Right? And then we're going to model your vote outcome. So how you voted is a function of your treatment status, your covariates, and your compliance status. And it's a probit model. And we have a complicated equation here, which I'm going to break down. So this is our complicated equation, right? So why do we do this? So let's break this down to see what this actually is. So let's assume first, so this here is if your compliance status is a 1, so if you're a complier, and this is if you are a non-complier, and this is if you received each one of these treatments. So this here is your predicted vote outcome if you're a complier and you got the phone treatment. And here is if you're a non-complier and you got the phone treatment. And so this parameter alpha 1 here is basically the effect of compliance, or basically the phone call treatment in a sense, right? So this is we phoned you, but you didn't pick up. We phoned you and you picked up and you listened to us. So this parameter here is that difference in y. So similarly for this, right? So if we look across here, right? So what do we see? So let's look at this bottom row first of all. These are controls. These are people who didn't receive anything, right? But why are their outcomes different, right? So this one has an extra alpha 2 parameter here. And what is that? So this is basically saying your compliance status on the phone call treatment tells us something about your vote, right? So why would that ever be, right? So it could be the case that if you're a complier, you're sort of more civic-minded, you like filling out surveys, you like talking to the unions, and so we might think that your expected vote outcome is slightly different, maybe a little bit higher. Right? Let's look down this row, right? So beta M here, so this is, we recoded M to be like any of the male treatments, so this is like, so Z, we had a ZM right here. ZM is basically 1 if you got any of the male treatments and 0 otherwise. So this is a male sort of parameter here. And what does this mean? So remember, our compliance status is only on phone call treatment. It's not on sort of the male treatments. So you can comply on male as well, but we don't ever observe that. But we might think that your propensity to comply on the phone call treatment is related to your propensity to comply on your mail treatment. So if you never answer your phone, then it's probably more likely that you never read your mail either, right? So we're going to leverage sort of information about compliance on your phone call. And so this parameter here reflects that your compliance status on your phone call doesn't perfectly predict your compliance status on your mail. So this is sort of the difference here, right? So so here is like, you got a mail. So let's look at this versus this, right? So if you never received the phone call, then your vote shouldn't matter depending on whether you got the phone call or not. But here, there's a little bit of a parameter, but because like you still got the mail, so there's still a tiny effect there that we want to capture. And then the additional effect, there's an additional effect for each mail treatment here, because if compliance on phone call perfectly predicts compliance on mail, then this is the treatment effect of compliers versus no compliers. And so we have this complicated model to try to capture what we think might be going on in terms of leveraging compliance status on the phone call as information on compliance status of mail, even though we never observe mail compliance. That sort of makes sense? I think we do a slightly better job of describing this in the paper than I just did. But so this algorithm is MCMC with a give sampler. So we're going to draw missing age values, draw missing outcome values, draw your latent compliance status on your phone call treatment, and then we're going to draw your ITT effects, so your intention to treat effects. And remember, this is the effect of being assigned treatment, not the effect of actually receiving treatment. So mathematically, it's like this. This is just a fancy way of saying your expected value on Y if you got the phone call treatment, your expected value on Y if you got control. Okay. And here we limit it to group A and group B because these specific mail treatments were only for group A or group B. Right. So this is our ITT effects. Basically, think about this as the effect of treatment assignment. And then we have a case, so complier average causal effect. This did not look like that, but it basically looks like that. So we have this extra term here, C. So this only applies if we drew that you were a complier. Right, so this is the effect of the phone call treatment assignment for people who picked up the phone and listened to what we have to say. Okay. And here are our results. Right, so the model I presented was this column here, but let's look across here. Right, so these are all we multiplied by 100, so these are all in percentage terms. So this is right here. If we just took the difference in means, difference between phone calls and control, there's a 7 percentage point difference. So you were 7 percentage points less likely to vote for coalition if you got the phone call treatment versus not, amongst complete cases only. And so this effect is pretty consistent. It's 5 to 7%. this last model here, this takes into account your missingness in outcomes and your non-compliance. It's about 6%. Right? None of these male treatments are really significant. They're all negative. So they all kind of reduced your coalition vote, but they're not statistically significant. I think the effects are too small with our sample size to be able to get significant results. Here, negative 9.86. So amongst people who were assigned the phone treatment and answered the phone and listened to what we have to say, you are about 10 percentage points less likely to vote for the coalition. Right, so this is a pretty strong result here.
That means in the first spot, right?
Sorry, what?
Like in the first spot.
That means you said, it's just who you voted for. So
You could have moved it down more, right?
moved.
You could have just voted for them second.
Yeah, you could have. Yeah, exactly. So conclusions, right? So we found a significant effect of phone calls on reducing coalition, but not mail or robocalls. That's mostly in agreement with the US experiments, right? So most people find that phone calls are better than mail. There is one experiment recently done by Bailey, Hopkins, and Rogers, which said that if you try to persuade them, they're actually less likely to vote for you. So that was an outlier. I don't really know if I really believe that result, but most of the time, it's in agreement with our results. Here, I think our innovation, first of all, beyond the methods, is just we have a way to identify the persuasion effects with compulsory voting. And most of the studies that I've seen, I don't think any of them have ever used principal stratification methods to broken experiments. I think this is the first study that we've ever seen. There are other studies that try to impute in different ways, but I think principal stratification is a very powerful way to do this. We have future avenues. We want to think about ways to design better experiments under great uncertainty. I think this is huge, right? The non-response in post-election surveys is a big, big problem. All persuasion studies try to do this. I think we need to think about the next frontier, about how better can we design a study such that we either don't rely on post-election surveys or increase the response rate of post-election surveys in some way. So we want other ways to measure vote outcomes. We want to think about other treatments to test, including varying the message in some way. And so that's stuff that we're thinking about for the future. And I think that's all I have. Thanks.
Well, we have a few minutes if you want to ask some questions.
Yeah.
The phone calls, were they all to landlines or to cell phones?
So we tried, if we had both, we tried cell phone first, and then we tried landlines if we couldn't reach you on your cell phone.
Cell phones first. Right.
So the answer is it varies, but we tried to get your cell phone first.
The other small comment I guess I had to make was that it'd be very interesting to see outcomes would change if you were to ask someone to vote for a party instead of saying don't vote for this party.
Right.
Because then people would obviously retain the vote of choice in this situation. They've got 9 other parties for them to vote for.
Mm-hmm.
And it'd be fascinating to see whether you get that effect that recent study showed, people disliking you saying that then. And then I wonder whether you see that replicated in the study.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely interesting, and I think that's ideal. I would say for this particular study, that was politically not as feasible because they don't want to be advocating for any specific party. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we actually we did a lot of analytics for them, and we actually see a jump when Kevin Rudd takes power in both sort of people become less undecided and people become more enthusiastic about volunteering for them for the ACTU. So we definitely see that jump. We didn't take that into account with the experiment because we were running into sample size issues as it is. I think one of the things we will do in the future is instead of having one big long survey where we ask you once how you vote it, we maybe want to do rolling surveys in some way. But I do agree that that's an issue, where if we ask you in May whether you're undecided, by July you may not be undecided anymore. Tyson?
Could the election result affect the response rate for the post-election survey?
That's a good question. I don't know. Possibly. I mean, we would have to craft a story of like, well, Labor lost, and so, or if I voted Labor, I'm kind of embarrassed, so I don't want to tell you, or something like that. I think it's possible. I do think, if that's true, I think we haven't thought about it. That's my answer, but I do think it's possible, and I do think we should think about it. Yeah. Right. So one thing I will say is that we have this in our paper, but if you don't believe any of our assumptions about missingness, but you make some other really strong assumptions. So if you think that the propensity to tell you who you voted for is lower amongst liberals and higher amongst Labor. So if you voted Labor, you're more likely to tell us that you voted for Labor. If you make that assumption, plus the assumption that your treatments don't actually hurt you. So it's not if you also make the assumption that if I call you, you're not actually going to vote more for the coalition. So it's either a zero effect or less for the coalition. If you make those two assumptions, then mathematically our results only underestimate your treatment effect. So we have that in the paper. I don't push it as much because those are really strong assumptions that you're making. But it's a plausible story. Right? Mm-hmm. I mean, there are definitely other countries with compulsory voting. I don't know their fees, but there are definitely countries. I don't know of any field experiments, and like I said, if anybody knows any, that would be great. Like literally everything I've read is in the U.S. I read like one in Canada and one in Britain, but I think it should be done in many other countries to validate our results, but I've never seen it. So. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. We didn't find really significant or strong results, and that's very important, right? Because if you look back, right, these estimates don't change a whole lot, right? So we made different assumptions and took into account missingness, but they don't change a whole lot. One explanation is, well, the missingness isn't that bad, right? And so it's almost random. That's one explanation. The other is that we just don't have the right variables to predict your missingness, right? And so I think either of them could be true, and I do think we didn't see any huge effects of any of the variables on predicting missingness. And so I do think there needs to be much more data collection on this, and that's where we're pushing the ACTU to do. It's just which party they were going to vote for.
Because you've been comparing a little bit with the U.S., but so many of them could have been uncertain which party within the coalition they were going to vote for.
That's definitely true. It could be they're definitely either Green or Labor, but they're uncertain.
Exactly, yeah. And it's, in a sense, it's a little bit different than in the U.S. Usually, when you are certain, you are actually between Democrats and Republicans, which is a bigger shift than in Greece.
That's a great point that we haven't. That we definitely need to think about, but we haven't thought about that yet. Any other questions? Thanks.
if you go on like his name, Vincent Paul Samitier, and all these papers out there. I think he presented at political economy. Yes, definitely. Yeah. So yes, he's working on a lot of stuff like this.
Ah, the mailing list. Thank you very much. No, it's all chewed up on the top end, actually. Oh, you're Tyson, right?
Yes.
Are you interested in going next week? I'll try to see if someone volunteers.
Yes.
Oh, you would? That would make my life because for some reason no one wanted to go second. We got people like here almost every other week.
Someone would be further up in the
Really?
world.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, that's really interesting. I'm at the school for help, not doing stuff. Yeah, I'm pretty well. And I know everything going really well at night. But, ways to strengthen this, I prefer birding. I think if I can swim, and you kind of tell one will type and ask you questions during, so it can be hard to figure out timing. I have arrows, I have shorter. I usually tell people slow down.
That was one of the things we were talking about. The same house. Almost everybody votes in this stuff.
Let's see. Well, I'll use Steve's gonna email. Yeah, well, and then I would also send them I mean, I guess all of the business manual, then I'll send it. And then it's a step that you apparently not.
So we actually they went
People don't believe me, you know. This tends to be a workshop where you're expecting to help them to change the council paper.
Volunteering for next week.
No, I think he seems less excited about it than Thank you so much, Pedro. That was fun. Yeah, yeah.
It's like a slower.
Yeah, it is.
I I think I was
Yeah.
very
I know.
impressed with the fact that this was
You still think this is a very equal cup or no cup? There's usually a better crowd.
like a lot of people were just
Yeah, no, this is quite a different workshop, probably than
into
some
They would have the research workshop.
because it's interdisciplinary.
I mean,
Like you can
like
stats,
I think
political science, sociology,
and
public health.
a lot of them are out of date, but they at least have them.
So,
But
do you have any more questions?
exactly. So it's like it's a whole any of you just passed there's a privacy law that's coming out.
Yeah, it's very, it's like motivation,
Or
you know, to like
easy to
that does more than one. I mean, I'm sure you've been talking to people.
Oh, yeah.
For longer.
You know how you talking about the glossy banana labs and then how it differs specifically things very quick. That's actually my point later. I mean, I guess the using the extra
Yeah, exactly.
napkins is very like that. I used to have like sushi salad, but I used to find like it was a very
That was actually
maybe there's
I get very, yeah.
Oh, really bad. I'm not very I bet. I mean, it's an assumption, obviously, but
So if we gave you that,
yeah, no, it is. It's very fun. Yeah, definitely.
Because
Yeah.
That was but I mean that's
Yeah, well, let my balance.
yeah, it'd be so much. It'd be really interesting to see more of this happen in Australia. Looking at data and things.
Like that's what I was saying.
we're trying to there are people very present, but it's still
Yeah.
everything.
And there's like there's a 2001 movie.
Andrew.
Narrow subset of what I would like.
I'm glad we had some Australians. Well, I think we enjoyed that.
Yeah.
You have to turn off the recording or anything?
Oh, I should probably stop that.
For your post-election thing, did they say they were like from the like labor union organization? Okay.
I mean, that's clearly a big issue.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking if they do like, I don't know if they do exit polls like they do in the U.S., but if so, you could like potentially try to like model what you would expect your like sample, how you'd expect them to vote based on the exit poll data, like give similar demographic characteristics, and see if they like were reasonable. It might give you like some base validity to your.
I think like, we thought a lot about this. The main problem is that our sample is like union members.
Yeah.
So when you take like exit polls, it's like
They don't identify. They don't ask them whether they're union members.
and then you have to make this assumption like the
Yeah.
union member is the same as everybody else.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I guess there's not enough like demographic characteristics to really meaningfully.
I mean, there's this thing I've heard in Germany where they literally kind of like exit polls, but somebody will stand there outside the voting booth and just hand out a piece of paper with, say, well, you fill out just exactly the same way you fill out your ballot for us.
Yeah.
And like they actually do that.
Wow.
And like I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
Like I didn't know if you could do that, but and we like the study would have to be different. Like we'd have to do it on everybody. And we'd have to see like,
we normally, we also come out